By 1780, Britain appeared to be winning the American Revolution. Major American cities had fallen. The Continental Army had suffered devastating defeats. Across the South, British commanders believed the colonies would soon return to the crown. For many patriots, the future of the Revolution had never looked darker. And yet, just 2 years later, Britain's seemingly unstoppable campaign in the South had completely unraveled. Not because the British Army suffered one catastrophic defeat, but because it had been slowly exhausted, outmaneuvered, and forced into fighting a war it could never truly control. The man behind this remarkable turnaround wasn't the most famous general of the Revolution. In fact, many Americans today have never even heard his name. His name was Nathanael Greene, a former blacksmith's son with almost no formal military training. A man who taught himself military strategy by studying history, tactics, and the campaigns of history's greatest commanders. And a leader who understood one simple truth. Sometimes, the fastest way to win a war is not to win every battle, but to wear your enemy down. Instead of chasing dramatic battlefield victories, Greene did something completely unexpected. He stretched British supply lines, forced exhausting marches through hostile territory, kept British soldiers constantly moving, constantly fighting, and constantly losing strength. British commanders won battle after battle, yet somehow found themselves losing the entire Southern campaign. So how did one little-known American general outsmart the most powerful army in the world? How did a commander who rarely won decisive battles help pave the road to America's greatest victory at Yorktown? And why do military historians still study his campaign more than 2 centuries later? This is the incredible story of Nathanael Greene, the forgotten general who slowly exhausted an empire. By the summer of 1780, the American Revolution was in its darkest hour. The British had shifted their strategy to the south, believing that thousands of loyalists would rally to the crown once British troops arrived. At first, that strategy seemed to be working. In May 1780, Charleston, South Carolina, fell after weeks of siege. More than 5,000 American soldiers were forced to surrender, the largest American capitulation of the Revolutionary War. For the Continental Army, it was a devastating blow. But the worst was still to come. Just 3 months later, on August 16, 1780, American forces under General Horatio Gates confronted the British near Camden, South Carolina. The battle quickly turned into a catastrophe. Inexperienced militia broke under the pressure of the British assault. The Continental Army simply disintegrated. Soldiers fled the battlefield in panic. General Gates reportedly rode nearly 200 miles to Charlotte, leaving much of his shattered army behind. It was one of the most humiliating defeats of the entire Revolutionary War. News of Camden spread rapidly across the colonies. Confidence in the revolution plummeted. Many feared the southern states would soon fall under permanent British control. In London, British leaders grew increasingly optimistic. If the South could be secured, they believed the rebellion would eventually collapse. Even General Charles Cornwallis, one of Britain's most experienced commanders in America, believed victory was finally within reach. The situation was so desperate that George Washington needed someone who could do far more than simply win battles. He needed a commander who could save an entire campaign, not with overwhelming force, but with patience, discipline, and strategy. Someone who could rebuild a broken army, restore the confidence of exhausted soldiers, and somehow challenge the world's most powerful military with limited men, limited supplies, and almost no room for error. There was no obvious choice. Several experienced commanders had already failed. But Washington placed his trust in a quiet, disciplined general from Rhode Island, a man who had never sought fame, yet possessed one of the sharpest strategic minds in the Continental Army. His name was Nathanael Greene. Few could have predicted it at the time, but Greene's appointment would become one of the most important decisions of the entire Revolutionary War. At first glance, nothing about Nathanael Greene suggested he would become one of the greatest generals of the American Revolution. He wasn't born into a wealthy military family. He never attended a prestigious military academy. And unlike many British officers, he had no formal military education. Born in 1742 in the colony of Rhode Island, Greene was raised in a Quaker family, a community that valued peace and generally opposed warfare. It was an unlikely beginning for a man who would one day command armies. As a young man, Greene worked in his family's iron foundry, where discipline, patience, and problem-solving became part of his daily life. But what truly set him apart was an endless desire to learn. Unable to receive a traditional military education, Greene created one for himself. He spent countless evenings reading books on history, mathematics, engineering, and military strategy. He studied the campaigns of commanders such as Julius Caesar and Frederick the Great, searching not only for how they won battles, but why they won them. Books became his military academy. Long before he ever commanded soldiers, Greene had already trained himself to think like a strategist. When the American Revolution began in 1775, he joined a local militia. Despite walking with a slight limp, Greene refused to let it stand in the way of a military service. His intelligence, calm judgment, and willingness to learn quickly caught the attention of George Washington. The two men developed a relationship built on mutual trust and respect. Washington repeatedly entrusted Greene with some of the Continental Army's most difficult assignments. He commanded troops in major campaigns. Later, as Quartermaster General, he helped reorganize the Continental Army's struggling supply system, one of the most difficult and thankless jobs of the Revolution. Time and again, Greene proved that he could solve problems that seemed impossible. By 1780, Washington faced the greatest crisis of the war. The Southern campaign was collapsing. Many officers doubted anyone could turn the situation around. But Washington saw something others didn't. He saw a commander who understood that wars are not always won by spectacular victories. Sometimes they are won through patience, endurance, and relentless pressure. So Washington made one of the boldest decisions of the Revolution. He handed command of the Southern Army to Nathanael Greene. Few could have imagined it then, but Washington's decision would become one of the defining moments of the Southern campaign. When Nathanael Greene arrived to take command of the Southern Army, he faced a painful reality. His force was outnumbered, poorly equipped, short of food, ammunition, and even clothing. Many of his soldiers had marched for months without proper supplies. Others were inexperienced militia. A conventional battle against the British Army would almost certainly end in another disaster. Greene understood something that many commanders did not. He could not defeat the British by fighting their kind of war. So instead, he changed the rules. Rather than keeping his entire army together, Greene made a bold and controversial decision. He divided his already outnumbered force. To many officers, the idea seemed reckless. A smaller army should never split itself in the face of a stronger enemy. But Greene believed mobility was more valuable than numbers. A divided army could move faster, gather supplies more easily, threaten British positions from multiple directions, and force the enemy to spread its own troops across hundreds of miles. One wing of the army was placed under the command of Daniel Morgan, one of the Continental Army's most capable battlefield leaders. Meanwhile, Greene led the remaining force himself. Supporting them were local patriot militia and partisan fighters, including commanders such as Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, and Thomas Sumter, whose constant raids harassed British outposts and supply lines. Together, they refused to give the British what they wanted, a single decisive battle. Instead, they struck unexpectedly, disappeared into forests and swamps, attacked isolated detachments, captured supplies, and forced British commanders to react rather than dictate the campaign. For General Charles Cornwallis, the war was becoming increasingly frustrating. Every town he occupied demanded soldiers to defend it. Every mile he advanced stretched his supply lines farther. Every apparent victory seemed to create another problem. Greene wasn't trying to destroy the British army in one dramatic confrontation. He was slowly wearing it down, forcing it to spend precious time, precious men, and precious resources. Without realizing it, Cornwallis had entered the kind of war Greene wanted him to fight. A war of movement, a war of endurance. And before long, that strategy would lead both armies into one of the most remarkable military chases in American history. The race to the Dan. By early 1781, Greene's strategy was beginning to work. Instead of destroying the Continental Army, General Charles Cornwallis found himself chasing it across the Carolinas, across swollen rivers, through muddy roads, and over hundreds of miles of unforgiving countryside. Greene understood that every mile mattered. Every day the British remained on the move. Their supplies dwindled, their horses weakened, and their soldiers grew more exhausted. Rather than standing and fighting, Greene continued his retreat northward. To some observers, it looked like another American withdrawal, but this was no panic. Every movement was carefully planned. Greene knew exactly where he was going. His destination was the Dan River, which marked the border between North Carolina and Virginia. Weeks earlier, Greene had quietly ordered boats gathered along the Virginia side of the river. If his army could reach the crossing before Cornwallis, the British pursuit would come to an abrupt end. The race became one of speed, endurance, and precise timing. As Greene's soldiers marched relentlessly toward the Dan, light troops under Colonel Eutaw Williams, supported by local patriot militia, screened the retreat and slowed the British advance, buying precious time. Cornwallis pushed his veterans just as hard. They marched through rain, mud, and bitter winter weather, convinced they were on the verge of destroying Greene's army once and for all. The distance between the two armies grew dangerously small. At several points, the British were only hours behind. Then, on February 14th, 1781, Greene's final troops crossed the Dan River into Virginia. Every boat disappeared to the Virginia shore. When Cornwallis finally reached the river, there were no boats left, no bridge to cross, and no practical way to continue the pursuit. After weeks of relentless marching, the Continental Army had escaped without fighting a major battle. Greene had won without fighting. The British had marched hundreds of exhausting miles, consumed valuable supplies, and failed to destroy the army they had been chasing. Greene had spent weeks avoiding the battle Cornwallis desperately wanted. Now, with fresh reinforcements behind him, he would choose the battlefield himself, Guilford Courthouse, a battle Britain would win, at a cost it could scarcely afford. On March 15th, 1781, the two armies finally met near Guilford Courthouse in present-day North Carolina. After weeks of maneuvering, retreats, and relentless pursuit, Nathanael Greene had decided it was finally time to fight. But even now, he refused to fight on British terms. Drawing inspiration from Daniel Morgan's victory at Copens just 2 months earlier, Greene arranged his army in 3 defensive lines. Experienced Continental soldiers formed the final line. Militia units stood in front, ordered to fire a few volleys before falling back. The plan was simple: force the British to attack again and again, paying for every yard of ground they captured. General Charles Cornwallis did exactly what Greene expected. British regulars advanced with discipline and determination. The fighting quickly became fierce. Smoke filled the woods. Musket fire echoed across the battlefield. Units became separated in the confusion. At one desperate moment, Cornwallis made an extraordinary decision. With British and American soldiers fighting dangerously close together, he ordered his own artillery to fire directly into the melee. The cannon fire struck both armies, but it finally broke the American resistance. By late afternoon, Greene ordered an organized withdrawal. The British remained on the field. By the traditional rules of 18th century warfare, they had won the battle. But victory came at an enormous cost. More than a quarter of Cornwallis's army had been killed, wounded, or captured. Many of those losses were veteran soldiers, men Britain could not easily replace thousands of miles from home. Greene understood exactly what had happened. He had lost the battlefield. But Cornwallis had lost something even more valuable: the strength to continue his campaign. One British officer reportedly described the victory with bitter irony. Another such victory would ruin the British army. Within days, Cornwallis abandoned the Carolina interior. Instead of pursuing Greene, he marched north into Virginia, hoping to regroup and receive support. It seemed like another British advance. In reality, it was the beginning of the end, because every step toward Virginia carried Cornwallis closer to a place called Yorktown. After Guilford Courthouse, many assumed Nathanael Greene would continue avoiding major confrontations. Instead, he did something Cornwallis never expected. Rather than following the British Army into Virginia, Greene turned south. His objective was no longer to destroy Cornwallis. It was to reclaim the Carolinas, town by town, fort by fort, outpost by outpost. While Cornwallis marched north in search of a decisive victory, Greene focused on dismantling Britain's control of the South. Throughout the spring and summer of 1781, American forces steadily regained ground. British garrisons found themselves increasingly isolated. Patriot militia intensified their attacks on supply lines and communications. One by one, British outposts came under pressure. Greene fought determined campaigns at places such as Hobkirk's Hill, 96, and Eutaw Springs. He did not win every battle. In fact, several ended with the British holding the field. But the pattern never changed, even when Greene lost the battlefield. The British often paid a price they could not afford. Every engagement cost them experienced soldiers. Every march consumed precious supplies. Every victory left them weaker than before. Greene understood that controlling territory required more than winning battles. It required holding that territory. And Britain was steadily losing its ability to do so. By late 1781, British control over much of the southern interior had been severely weakened, leaving them largely confined to a handful of coastal strongholds. Meanwhile, Cornwallis's decision to move into Virginia placed his army exactly where George Washington and the French commander, Comte de Rochambeau, hoped it would be. With the support of the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse, Allied forces surrounded Cornwallis at Yorktown. In October 1781, the British army surrendered. It was the decisive military victory that effectively ended major combat in the Revolutionary War. Many historians view Greene's southern campaign as a crucial factor in setting the stage for Yorktown. By exhausting Cornwallis, forcing him out of the Carolinas, and steadily dismantling British control of the South, Greene helped shape the chain of events that led to America's final military triumph. History remembers the victory at Yorktown, but it too often forgets the general who helped make that victory possible. History often celebrates the generals who win the biggest battles, the commanders whose victories change the course of wars in a single dramatic day. Nathanael Greene was different. He rarely won spectacular battlefield triumphs. He never captured an entire British army. He was never present at Yorktown when the final surrender took place. Yet his influence can be found throughout the closing chapter of the American Revolution. Greene understood something that many commanders throughout history have struggled to accept. A war is not always won by destroying your enemy. Sometimes, it is won by exhausting them, by forcing them to spend more soldiers, more supplies, more time than they can ever afford to lose. Instead of chasing glory, Greene chose patience. Instead of risking everything on one decisive battle, he fought a campaign built on movement, endurance, and relentless pressure. It wasn't the fastest path to victory, but it proved to be one of the most effective. After the war, Greene returned to private life. He accepted a plantation called Mulberry Grove in Georgia as a recognition for his service. Sadly, he did not live long enough to witness how history would remember the Revolution. In 1786, at just 43 years old, Nathanael Greene died only a few years after the war had ended. Today, military historians continue to study his Southern campaign as one of the finest examples of strategic warfare in American history. His ability to preserve a weaker army, stretch an enemy's resources, and transform apparent defeats into long-term success remains a lesson taught in military academies around the world. Perhaps that is Greene's greatest legacy. He proved that brilliant leadership is not measured only by the battles you win, but by the victories you make possible. The American Revolution produced many heroes. Some inspired a nation, some secured its independence, and some quietly changed the course of history without ever becoming household names. Nathanael Greene was one of them, the general who didn't defeat the British Empire in a single battle, but slowly, patiently, exhausted it. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more incredible stories from American history, military strategy, and world history, subscribe to ThinkVerse. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.